Loneliness had never asked permission, only taken. Ewan Creed knew that truth like he knew the shape of his land. Rough, quiet, and scarred. The wind at Red Bluff Crossing cut through his coat like it wanted to remind him what he'd lost. His mule trod slow through patches of dirty snow, hooves dull against the frozen ground. He hadn't spoken to another soul in days, hadn't needed to. Silence was easier than false comfort. He wasn't supposed to stop, not this time. But then he saw her, just a shape under the station awning, curled like a forgotten animal. Rags, bare skin, no coat, no shoes, no sound. She looked less like a woman and more like something the world had decided not to carry anymore. He could have kept walking. Should have. That was the rule now. Don't care, don't bleed. But something moved in him. A stubborn flicker, maybe. Or just the echo of a man who used to believe in decency. He stepped off the wagon. Each boot crunch felt louder than it should have, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Her body flinched at his shadow, too weak to run. Green eyes, barely open, stared up at him without asking. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't speak, just nodded once. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from. The world had already asked enough of her. That night, as the wagon creaked through the hills and the wind screamed behind them, Ewan Creed sat beside a stranger he could have ignored. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like shame. Because someone had left her there to die, and everyone else had walked by. The fire in Ewan Creed's cabin wasn't warm enough to chase off the kind of cold that lived inside a man. Not anymore. But it was heat, and heat was what she needed. He carried her past the creaking threshold like something sacred and broken, wrapped in his coat, barely breathing. Her body was limp, like it had already decided to give up, until his arms convinced it otherwise. She didn't speak, not when he laid her on the cot, not when he covered her with a second blanket, not even when he handed her the tin cup of steaming broth he'd stirred slowly over the fire. Her hands trembled as she took it, eyes never leaving his face. Ewan didn't look away either. Not in pity, and not in hunger. Just seeing. Her voice cracked once. "Is this your place?" "Yeah," he replied, simple as snow. She watched him like she was waiting to be asked. Asked what happened. Asked what she was doing half-naked under a rotting train platform in a town that had no soul left to spare. But the question never came. He just moved around the cabin in silence, slow, respectful. Made her soup. Hung a blanket near the stove so she could bathe. Laid a shirt and socks by the cot and turned his back as she changed. There was something almost unbearable in that kindness. When she emerged, skin still pink from warm water, wearing his undershirt tied at the waist, her eyes softened, but her spine stayed stiff, like she wasn't ready to let herself rest, even now. "You live alone?" she asked. "Always," he said. She nodded. Not in agreement, but in understanding. The kind only lonely people recognize in one another. Later, by the fire, she asked the question slowly, like peeling a scab. "You not gonna ask what they did to me?" "No," he said. Silence stretched between them, not sharp, but deep. "Why not?" "Figured if you wanted to tell me, you would." She didn't cry, didn't even blink. Just looked at him like he'd said something nobody ever had. It was the first mercy. The next day, she tried to stand, her legs weak from hunger and cold. He offered his hand. She waved it off, proud and trembling. He didn't insist, just stood nearby, quiet, present. By afternoon, she was helping chop vegetables, her hands shaky on the knife. At night, she ate sitting across from him, elbows on the table like she belonged there. They didn't speak much, but they didn't have to. There was a rhythm starting to form, unspoken, fragile. She swept the cabin floor in the mornings with a broom made from pine branches. Washed their tin cups. Folded the shirt she'd borrowed and the ones she hadn't. She wasn't trying to earn her keep. She was trying to remember what it felt like to be part of something. Even if that something was two people breathing the same quiet air. Ewan noticed it all. He noticed the way she would flinch if his footsteps came too close. The way her hands pulled his coat tighter at night, even when the fire was hot. The way her eyes tracked every sound. She wasn't healed. Not yet. But she was here. And for a man who had long since stopped believing anything worth keeping would ever stay, her presence was thunder. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, back stiff from the chair, and glance toward the cot. Her silhouette was curled like a comma, her breath steady now. Her face turned toward the fire, not the wall. That was how he knew. She was choosing this. Maybe not him. Not yet. But the quiet, the safety, the space. And for now, that was enough. In a world that turns its back on broken things, stories like this remind us that sometimes healing begins not with words, but with quiet hands, warm food, and someone who doesn't ask for more than you're ready to give. If this story moved something in you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more Wild West tales that speak without shouting, and share it with someone who believes healing doesn't need noise, just a place to begin. This is only the beginning. The days passed slow, like honey over cold stone. Snow deepened outside the cabin, gathering at the windowsills and swallowing the old path to town. Euan didn't mind. He'd lived through worse winters alone. But this time, something felt different. Not warmer, just less empty. Calla moved like she didn't trust the floor to hold her. Quiet steps, careful gestures. She'd started folding all his shirts, not just the one he gave her. Each was placed neatly into the wooden crate by the wall, stacked with a precision that wasn't pride. It was reverence. She swept the floor in the mornings, unasked, wiped soot from the hearth with an old cloth, fed the fire before he rose. She was becoming part of the room, not in a loud way, not in a way that claimed space, but in the way steam becomes part of the air. Euan noticed. He noticed everything. The way she tied his undershirt with twine at the waist, the way it rode high on her thighs when she leaned over the hearth, the way her cheeks started to glow again when the fire caught them just right. He tried not to look. Sometimes he failed. But what struck him more than her softness, more than her quiet beauty, was how she was trying, really trying, to believe she was safe. As if the body might stay still long before the soul could catch up. They moved around each other with rhythm, one built not by words, but by small acts. She handed him the knife without asking. He passed her firewood without needing to speak. She washed the tin cups and set them to dry. He stacked them where they belonged. No one said it, but they were building a life. One morning, he came in from the barn and found her by the window, hair loose and brushed back. She looked like something sunlight had remembered. She didn't turn when he stepped in, just kept her eyes on the snow falling. "You always keep to yourself like this?" she asked softly. He shrugged off his coat. "Mostly." "No wife?" He shook his head. "You ever think about it?" He paused at the stove. The fire behind him crackled once. "I used to." She didn't press, just nodded like she already knew the answer. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. Her hand brushed his as she passed it over. Not by accident, not on purpose. Somewhere in between. That afternoon, she asked if she could go outside. Euan studied her. "It's cold." "I'll be quick." He gave her his boots, twice too big. She wrapped rags around her ankles to keep them from slipping, tied the laces with twine. He watched from the window as she stepped into the yard, arms crossed under the coat. She made one small circle in the snow, then stopped at the fence. Leaned on it. Looked at the trees like they were the only things that hadn't asked her to explain herself. When she came back in, cheeks red, she smiled faintly. "Still alive?" He nodded. "That's something." That night, while they sat by the fire, she asked what he knew was coming. "Why are you really out here alone?" He didn't answer right away. Just watched the flames. Then finally, voice low, jaw tight, he spoke. "My folks were ranchers, had land east of here. Big enough to fight over. Neighbor wanted it. Made a deal with a mining outfit. When my father wouldn't sell, they sent men. Hired guns, burned our barn, poisoned the well." He stopped. Her fingers reached across the space between them, light on his wrist. "I came home one night and the house was empty," he said. "Nothing left." She didn't speak, just listened. "I left, didn't go after them. I was done bleeding for other people's choices." She nodded slowly, not in judgment, just in witness. You ever wish you stayed? Started over? She asked. He looked at her then. Firelight flickered across her face. Her lips still cracked but full. Her eyes weren't soft. They were steady, respectful. Like she saw him the way he hadn't seen himself in years. I don't know, he said. Maybe it still matters. Maybe it doesn't. She stood and moved to the hearth to stir the pot. The coat slipped off one shoulder. She didn't fix it. And he didn't look away fast enough. There was something hanging between them now. Not tension. Not lust. Just possibility. A question neither dared to speak, but both felt under the skin. She didn't turn to the wall that night, and he didn't sleep in the chair. He sat near the hearth, just a few feet from her, listening to the fire settle and the wind hum over the rooftop. Her breath was steady now. Warm. Present. Euan Creed had known silence all his life, but this was the first time it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like beginning. He didn't know if she'd stay, didn't ask. But when the sun rose the next morning and her face turned toward him instead of the wall, he knew something had changed. And when she said his name, just once, softly, like a stone dropped into water, he realized the cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming a home. Spring didn't come all at once. It crept in slow, like a woman testing the floorboards after too many falls. The snow thinned, retreated from the ridges. Mud took its place, heavy and quiet. The path to town became passable again, though neither of them had spoken of it. Not directly. Until one morning, as Euan laced up his boots by the hearth, Calla said softly, I want to go back. He didn't ask where. He already knew. Red Bluff Crossing still sat like a bruise on the land, faded but not healed. The town hadn't grown kinder. It hadn't changed. That much was certain. And yet, she wanted to return to the very place that had once looked through her like glass. They rode in silence. The wagon creaked beneath them as they crossed thawed-out ground, slush kicking up behind the wheels. The sky was dull, smeared with pale clouds. Euan kept one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh. Calla sat beside him, wrapped in his old coat, hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She didn't look fragile, not anymore. But there was something taut in her posture, like a cord drawn just shy of snapping. He looked over once. We don't have to. Her eyes stayed forward. I do. The town came into view like a memory you don't want, but can't shake. Weather-worn facades, slanted rooftops, dust curling around the edges of buildings that didn't care if you remembered them or not. Euan slowed the wagon as they passed the livery. Same creaky sign, same old clerk behind the feed counter. They stopped in front of the general store, the place where he'd once bought mule grain, the same place he'd walked past her, half dead and abandoned, on the station platform. Calla stepped down first. Her boots struck the porch boards like thunder, though they made barely a sound. Euan followed, a half step behind. They moved together shoulder to shoulder into the dim interior. Inside, the air was still thick with the scent of kerosene, tobacco, and thyme. Shelves lined with canned goods and burlap sacks. A woman near the beans paused mid-reach, eyes dragging over Calla like she was an echo that shouldn't have returned. Near the barrels of flour, a man shifted. Middle-aged, clean boots, soft hands. His gaze lingered longer than necessary. She didn't flinch. She picked up a tin of coffee, a small bar of soap, salt. Everything exact, like she'd practiced in her head how to move through this place with purpose. Euan stood beside her like a stone. Didn't think she'd show her face again, the man by the flour muttered. Not loud, but enough to hear. Calla froze, but only for a breath. Euan turned, slow. His voice low, even. She's worth more than you. No threat. No heat. Just fact. The man blinked like the words had weight, like they landed somewhere he didn't expect. Calla didn't look at either of them. She just moved forward, basket steady in her hands. At the counter, Grover the clerk bagged their goods without a word. Not once did his eyes meet hers. It was as if he still couldn't bear to acknowledge what he hadn't done that day, the day they all left her to freeze. When they stepped out into the morning light, Calla paused on the porch. Her fingers tightened around the basket's handle. "That used to ruin me," she said, voice barely audible. "The way they look, like I'm dirt they forgot to sweep." Euan adjusted the sack on his shoulder. "You don't have to come back if you don't want to." She shook her head. "I do, again and again, until I stop caring." They didn't speak after that, not on the walk to the wagon, not as they loaded supplies, not as they turned toward home. But something had changed. Not in the way she walked or how she sat beside him, but in her eyes. The fear was still there, buried deep, but it no longer held the reins. That afternoon, back at the cabin, she found the tattered prairie dress folded at the bottom of the trunk, the same one she'd worn when he found her. Without a word, she brought it to the stove. She didn't shake when she lit the match. The fabric burned fast, ripped seams, dirt-stained bodice, every cruel memory sewn into its threads, turned to ash. She watched it all disappear. Euan stood nearby, silent. Not interfering, just bearing witness. When the flame died down, she turned to him. Her eyes held nothing but clarity. "That life's over," she said. And he nodded, because there was nothing else to say. That night, they sat on the porch. The chair he'd built for her creaked under her weight. The air smelled of pine and smoke. Her hand found his. She didn't ask him to promise her a future. She just needed to know she had a place in one. And in the silence, with the trees whispering overhead and the stars blinking awake, she began to believe, maybe for the first time, that being loved didn't have to feel like being owned. That being seen didn't mean being stared at. That being kept could mean being chosen. And that home might be quieter than she expected, but no less real. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, not rehearsed, but earned. Calla rose with the sun now. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, kneading dough, hanging clothes to dry, pressing seeds into the soil of the old garden plot that Euan once thought would stay barren forever. Her sleeves were always rolled high. Mud caked her boots, her hair tied back with a strip of linen that had seen better days. And when she stood at the stove, her profile caught by morning light, she didn't look like someone who had survived ruin. She looked like someone building something. Euan watched her, often in silence. He wasn't a man who spoke more than needed, but there were things in the way he reached for her bowl after dinner or handed her a jacket when the wind picked up that said what words couldn't. He didn't touch her like a man who claimed. He touched her like a man who respected that she stayed. One evening, she found the coat he'd wrapped around her that first night, folded neat in the old trunk beneath the bed. She picked it up and held it for a long time. Not like a relic, but like a question. When she sat down beside him at the fire, she laid it across his lap. "I want to keep this," she said, "not because I'm still cold, but to remember what it felt like. Being seen." He didn't say much, just nodded, his fingers brushing the edge of the wool like it meant more than he could explain. They never spoke of the man who called her worthless, or the way no one had lifted a hand to help her. Some things didn't need retelling, not when they were being rewritten. But Calla wasn't content to just exist inside a safer story. She wanted to be more than the woman he rescued. She needed to know this life was hers too. That she wasn't a guest in his world, living between the lines of his past. One morning, while pulling weeds near the chicken coop, she said it. "You still want to do this alone?" Euan looked up from mending the fence. Sunlight broke through the trees behind her. Her face was flushed, hair loose around her cheeks, strong, present. "I haven't been alone in months. I mean for good," she said. "I don't want to be something passing through, not anymore." "You aren't." "Then make it real," she said. "Say it." He didn't smile, didn't joke. He just set the hammer down, wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward her. When he reached her, he cupped her jaw with hands still dusty from cedar and dirt. "I want you to stay in this house, in this life, with me, as my wife." Her breath caught, not because she didn't expect it, but because it mattered. "No preacher?" she asked. "No papers?" "Just us," he said. "I ain't much for speeches." "Good," she whispered. Me neither. That night, Calla stood barefoot in the doorway as dusk poured gold across the hills. She wore one of his shirts, stitched at the waist to fit her, the hem brushing her thighs. Her legs were dusted with soil, her lips chapped from wind, but her eyes were fierce, steady. Euan came up behind her and wrapped an arm around her waist. He kissed the back of her neck, and she leaned into him without hesitation. "You think they'll stop talking?" she asked. "No," he said quietly, voice against her skin. She smiled. "Doesn't matter." Later that week, they rode into town again. This time, she wore her own boots, a skirt she'd sewn from flour sacks. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders. Heads still turned, but not because she looked broken, because she didn't. At the general store, Grover barely met her eyes when he handed over their supplies. But Euan did something different this time. When asked if they needed anything else, he said, "Yeah, we'll need a cradle come fall." The room went still. Calla didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just nodded. Back at the cabin, they built the cradle together. Euan carved the rails. Calla sanded the edges smooth. She tied a faded ribbon across the front slat, one she'd used in her hair the first week she arrived. The wind outside still howled at times, scraping across the windows like memory trying to get in. But inside, everything had shifted. One night, after cleaning the porch, Calla stood watching the stars. Euan came up behind her, wrapping her in his arms. They said nothing. There was no need, because now the cabin didn't echo. The garden had started to bloom again. The floorboards still creaked, but beneath them was something that hadn't been there before, rooted and real. She stayed, not because she had to, but because someone had finally made a life worth staying in. And because for the first time in her life she had chosen it herself. There was no wedding dress, no guests, no vows spoken under painted glass. But what they built was real. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't rescued. It was chosen. Every morning, Calla woke up beside a man who never asked her to be anything but herself. And every night, Euan sat beside a woman who didn't shrink from silence or carry her past like a chain. They still had scars. The land, the body, the memory, none of it had healed clean. But they weren't trying to erase what came before. They were building over it with their own hands. The cradle stood by the hearth now, waiting. A soft blanket folded inside. A home made not from timber or stone, but from presence. From quiet meals and muddy boots and shared breath in the cold. And love? It didn't come with grand speeches. It came with a coat offered on a frozen night, with a space made beside the fire. With not asking what had been done to her, but giving her the power to say it if she wanted. Calla was never property. Euan was never her savior. They were survivors, yes. But more than that, they were partners. And in a world that once measured her worth in dollars and silence, she had found something no one could put a price on. Belonging, not given, not begged for. Just chosen. And that, quiet as it was everything.